Welcome to the Food Junkies Food Addiction Summit.
Here we aim to provide you with the experience, strength, and hope of professionals actively working on the front lines in the field of food addiction.
The purpose of this summit is to educate you and increase overall awareness about food addiction as a disease with abstinence as the solution.
Every day for the month of October, we are sharing one inspiring speaker or highlighted food preparation video from the incredible Tony Vassallo of Moda Nutrition Inc. and the Real Food Revival Movement.
We have 4 weeks of interviews with the leaders in the field of food addiction, clinicians who are working on the front lines, registered dietitians and nutritionists that are working toward bridging the eating disorder and food addiction camps, and people just like you and me.
Here we talk about all things food addiction recovery. Most importantly, how to thrive rather than just survive.
So stay positive, make a change for yourself, tell others about your change, and hopefully the message will spread.
And as Vera always says,
the power is ours.
All right, guys, thank you so much for joining us again today on the Food Junkies Food Addiction Summit. We have Dr. Marty Lerner with us of Milestones. And so, Dr. Lerner, if you would just introduce yourself to us professionally, let us know, give us a background, if you would.
Sure. I'll try to do what we used to call the Reader's Digest version, 25 words or less. Formally, I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. The letters after my name are PhD. And on a personal front, I'm also someone who has firsthand experience with, I'll just use the genetic term, addiction, not the least of which we're talking about food addiction. In my world, we also call it eating disorders, and we'll talk about a little bit of the similarities and differences with the semantics that we use. So my disclaimer is some of what we'll talk about today, stems from more the letters after my name. And some of what we'll talk about today is anecdotal and some of my personal experiences. So they kind of fuse together in an amalgam of conversation, and I'll leave it to you to sort out which is which.
Yeah, I think we often find for most of us in this field, food addiction and eating disorder, there's a professional and a personal piece. So can you speak a little bit more about the personal piece and kind of like how food addiction, disordered eating disorder has impacted your life, and kind of if you had that aha moment?
Well, I'm trying to condense this so it's not a 3-hour, in AA, they call it a drunkalogue. Here, I guess it would be a foodalogue or something like that. Anyway, it was a very stormy night way back when my mother gave birth to me. I tried to crawl back in, but it was a no-go. Anyway, that said, professionally and personally, I'll try to explain a little bit about bringing you up to date. But basically, I wouldn't identify myself as being born with any kind of addiction or eating disorder or food addiction. I will tell you that at the age of 9, sometimes people will refer to this as a trauma. I really don't know about that. But my family suddenly informed me that we were moving from, our home in New York to Florida. And for me, it was a little bit, I guess you could say, traumatic or unnerving, because I found myself, from having a network of friends and comfort and a really nice childhood, into South Florida, which at the time was pretty barren. And I felt emotionally kind of bankrupt in the sense, looking back at it, of being pretty much alone. And what I will tell you, with hindsight being 2020, is that food became my companion. It's really that simple. And my parents were occupied with making a living. I spent a lot of time by myself. I learned how to cook and feed myself for the most part. And things that are easy to put from hand to mouth and whatever are what we probably identify as junk food, fast food, processed food, things that don't require preparation. So my journey into using food as a drug began at age 9. At age 13, I was twice a standard deviation from the norm of what a child should weigh at 13. And at the time, they called that juvenile onset obesity. There weren't terms like food addiction, compulsive overeating per se, binge eating, or any of that. It was just being called being fat or being obese as a child. And that led into a whole array of issues, shame that my parents had of being seen with me being so big, being teased in school. And, what normally happens with what I'll call now the symptom of obesity, and the problem or etiology really being, binge eating at the time, but who knew? Anyway, then began a whole array of treatments that were in desperation by my parents to try to remedy this, not the least of which, quick sidebars, my parents owned a drugstore. How nice. And I was introduced to something, little did I know, that I later used in college called Black Beauties or biphetamines. So the doctor gave me these little pills, Mother's Little Helpers, if you are into the Rolling Stones. And I would speed my bike to the bus stop. I would talk incessantly in school. My grades went up during the day. It was like being Jekyll and Hyde, and then I'd crash at night. So I had no appetite during the day, and then I ate voraciously. It's almost like a syndrome called Prader-Willi, where you never get enough. You can eat to the point of almost rupturing your stomach. So I was introduced to binge eating, little did I know, but it was enabled by the downregulation of dopamine, if I got technical about it, from using and abusing, not intentionally, amphetamines, which at the time were the standard treatment for the symptom, again, of obesity, where the real problem was compulsive or overeating, binge eating, or what some of us would call food addiction. So that was my foray into this realm, and then later it played, a role in other forms of self-medicating. When I was in school, I was in graduate school, and of course, I had an interest in the regulation of body weight, weight reduction, and at that time, still eating disorders were not a fashionable term. And so in my graduate days, I was what was called an experimental neuropsychologist. Translation, I would do surgery on mice and rats to find the parts of the brain that you could stimulate that would either turn on or turn off their appetites. And I was very successful, except none of the rodents that I operated on survived. So anyway, I found out that there are parts of the brain that if you stimulate it in a rat, the rat will starve itself to death. And if you stimulate another part of the brain, the lateral hypothalamus to be technical about it, the rat will eat until it ruptures its stomach. So I thought if I could find that part of the brain in me that turned off the appetite, I can drive a spike into it. And so we could see what kind of reasoning I had in graduate school, which was aided by vodka and a drug called methaqualone or Quaalude, which really helped my insight. But we will digress into another area with that. So I went in from rat surgery into doing some research with people, which are usually college subjects, college freshmen, and are great subjects for psych students and graduate students and whatnot. And what happened then, I was about 24 at the time. I was doing some research and did start, because it became known or familiar, the word eating disorders kind of came around, mostly with anorexia. Not so much with bulimia, let alone food addiction. There was some compulsive overeating in 12-step programs, but that was the semantics of the time. Anyway, I recruited a bunch of subjects to do this study, ostensibly, meaning deceptively, that it was about tasting ice cream and then rating it, but that was not the truth. What I did is I found three groups of people. People that were formerly obese, but now weren't, people that were currently overweight or obese, and people that never had a weight problem. And the weight which now I know is the poorest way to define an eating disorder or food addiction, because you have people that are not overweight that are food addicts or eating disorder, and you have people that are. And weight can be a symptom, or it could be, something that isn't a symptom. Anyway, at the time, weight was a proxy, in a sense, for eating disorders. So I wasn't expecting this, but what ended up happening in doing this research is I suddenly found a whole group of young women, mostly, that were freshmen and sophomores at the community college across from where I was a graduate student, who I found out were overeating, but also making themselves sick by either regurgitating or other compensatory behaviors like excessive exercising, or they would overeat and then not eat for a day or two. All kinds of different flavors or patterns of compensating for the overeating. And I learned the term bulimia. And it was just coming out of England. Chris Fairburn was doing some research at the time, and he coined the term bulimorexia. And then I published this article on a variant of anorexia that I used the term bulimorexia for. And all of a sudden, that research paper got published, and my destiny was sealed. So whether heaven or hell, I was kind of cornered into, this realm, both personally and professionally. And that's really how this all started. So from the age of about, I'd say 28 when I finished graduate school to now, where I'm 106, I've been dealing in the realm of eating disorders.
So, I love your humor. You are such a leader in this field, and you created Milestones, which treats eating disorders and food addiction. So how do you work clinically to separate what is eating disorder and what is food addiction?
Yeah, semantics is a funny thing in any profession, whether it's in medicine or psychology or engineering or whatever. So that said, I think the first thing that you have to recognize is one size doesn't fit all. Not everything fits into a very neat category. So I'm going to use a parallel here. Or a metaphor. If we were talking in medicine and women suffer from high incidence of breast cancer, men maybe from prostate cancer and whatnot, when you use the term prostate cancer, it can mean a lot of different things. And inherent in that, there's lots of different approaches. You can do a surgical procedure, or you could do, radioactive seed implants. You can do radiation. So there's a lot of different approaches. So you really have to define what is the subtype or flavor or progression, of the cancer. Same with women. There's a total radical mastectomy. There's a lumpectomy. There's doing nothing but radiation. There's chemo, so it's not as simple as black and white. So with food addiction and eating disorders, you're looking at a continuum. And on that continuum, you're looking at three factors in my world. One factor are emotional issues that drive the disease. The other are physiological or biological issues that drive the disease. And that what makes for the perfect storm is the setting or the environment or learning history. So that said, for purposes of understanding the concept, for the most part, food addiction is a combination of foods that someone has a sensitivity to or a proclivity towards becoming habituated to or dependent upon. So the nature of the substance for food addiction is more relevant than the emotional drivers, like trauma or emotional eating, or I overeat when I get anxious. However, to be fair about it, I don't know of anybody that you would categorize as a food addict where they recognize that independent of their affective emotional state, that if they picked up a drink or they picked up, a drink, and the drink was a milkshake, and it was mostly sugar and fat and whatever else, that they would be driven to overeat. Excuse that, if you're hearing the phone or whatever, it's, hold on. Okay. So, of course, if that's my wife, I may be sleeping downstairs on the couch. However, so if you're drinking alcohol, let's use the metaphor of an alcoholic. Not all alcoholics are 90% physically addicted to alcohol and 10% psychologically habituated to using alcohol as a crutch. However, when you're looking at food addiction, you're really looking at the biggest component, if you will, that the nature of the substance, sugar, flour, maybe salt, maybe, wheat, maybe whatever, mostly sugar and flour or very refined processed foods, are an automatic trigger. And then, independent of that, volume, even though there's something is devoid of the substance, but the volume, the amount, may lead, to overeating or binge eating even, but it may be more emotionally driven or externally driven. So it's not black and white. So let's just say, for purposes of what we're trying to explain in this podcast, is that food addiction is a collection of chemical dependencies to certain foods, and you'd have to identify what those foods are for you. If I'm an alcoholic and drug addict, I may across the board know that I cannot handle alcohol biologically in my system. However, some alcoholics can take some medications, and their medications like a sedative or a painkiller, and other alcoholics are cross-addicted, or because of sensitivity, that becomes a drug for them and not a medication. And so, maybe like for me, multigrains are something that don't trigger me. But for somebody else that's a food addict, it will trigger them. But where we meet in common ground is sugar in its purest substance form is definitely alcohol for every alcoholic and for every food addict. I don't know any food addicts that don't have a physiological reaction to sugar. But I do know people, inclusive of myself, if you were to label me that can tolerate certain foods that other food addicts could not. Eating disorders is a big umbrella. So eating disorders, the majority, but not all, have a sensitivity to certain food substances. But there are, to be fair about it, certain people with forms of restricting anorexia, certain people, although lesser so, with binge eating or compulsive overeating or bulimia, may be able to tolerate some foods that have sugar, but I think it's more the exception than the rule in my experience. However, for the purposes, again, of explaining the concept, eating disorders have more of an emotional driver or emotional eating component to it, although they do, to one degree or another, have the substance piece to it. So for me, the difference between a food addict and someone with an eating disorder is they may overlap and be one and the same, but they also may be different in that there are some people that have the same diagnosis, let's say two people with bulimia, and one have as much of a food addict component to them and the other doesn't. Why that is, we can go into a lot of research and whatnot, but I don't think it matters. So the most important thing I've ever taught anybody, or have been taught, is the phrase, so what, now what? So it doesn't matter why you became the pickle. You are not going back to cucumber land.
I love it. I'm writing down, so what, now what? It's just a great phrase that I think
it's
many
true.
clients, yes,
Well,
many people.
because
Go ahead.
people with addictions or compulsive people or perfectionists or a lot of us, tend to overthink and underdo. So we're paralysis by analysis. The assumption is that if we could figure out how to connect the dots, we've solved the problem. And that is a smokescreen or smoke and mirrors that will never solve an addiction. Never.
Yeah, no. Go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off, Marty.
No, I'm not,
Okay.
I'm not cut off.
Okay.
It's
Okay.
all right.
Excellent. So we want to dive a little bit deeper into this idea of volume addiction, because I think Clarissa and I both self-identify as volume addicts, but have found that many of our clients, it's fairly easy for them to put down the food substances, but then we're still having this proclivity, as you would say, to overeating, even Brussels sprouts, even broccoli, whatever. Can you talk a little bit about what is volume addiction? And
I'll talk about it personally and professionally. So let me tell you a quick story. I grew up with a friend named Harry. Some of you may have a Harry in your life. Doesn't matter. Harry's the type of person that goes to a restaurant. They say, your table will be ready in about 20 minutes. Why don't you have a seat at the bar? He sits at the bar, he orders a martini, and he leaves a quarter of it over when they call his table. Harry's the type of guy that you go out to dinner with, right? And you all order dessert. Harry takes a forkful of his pie and says, I just can't eat anymore. Harry's the type of guy who ends a relationship, or it's ended for him, and doesn't stalk his former girlfriend. You know what I mean? Harry's someone you want to see die slowly and painfully in front of you. Then there's a Marty. Marty is someone, probably like you guys, that you can identify with, that if he were sitting across from Harry at the town diner, Cedarhurst, New York, in high school, and Harry was having the standard meal of a cheeseburger, French fries with gravy, and a cherry Coke, and you were having the standard diet plate of a hamburger patty that looks like it was stepped on by an elephant, a piece of wilted lettuce, and a bleeding cherry on top of a scoop of cottage cheese, and Harry was struck by lightning, while they were trying to revive him, you would gently take his plate and finish his hamburger French fries, right? So that's a Harry. A Marty will finish whatever the restaurant serves as a portion. A Harry will eat and finish eating depending on internal cues of satiety, stomach distension, blood sugar, his hypothalamus mediating that. He's more internally governed as to cues of what to eat, and when to stop eating. He's, dare I say, normal in that area. Harry, by the way, was an entrepreneur in high school who was a pharmaceutical salesperson at the age of 16, who probably is doing time in a Mexican jail somewhere. However, he was not an addict, right? If I were selling food on a college campus, I would go broke because it would never get to the dorms. Okay, so now you understand. So the internal cues are like blood sugar levels, stomach distension, there's ghrelin, leptin, hormones, a whole bunch of stuff involved. And it's not dysfunction. Marty, or a food addict who has a volume issue, the reason you're overeating is because you're more externally oriented. Time of day, sight of food, smell of food, what's in front of you, you'll finish. Part of it is habit, but part of it is that you're not as attuned or skilled to intuitive eating, meaning internal cues of hunger, which is why I get driven nuts when people talk about treating eating disorders, amongst them food addicts, and saying intuitive eating. Well, the problem with that is that, your wiring is already dysfunctional. Whether that was acquired or you were born with it, so what, now what? So let me give you a quick example of this and then we'll move on. If I were taking an exam and Harry were next to me, we're taking the SATs to get into college. And we're not wearing a wristwatch, okay? But there's a clock in front. And we're feverishly, doing the test and whatnot. And we're both used to eating at 12:30, okay? Harry doesn't need to see a clock to know he's hungry and it's 12:30. I could work till 4 o'clock, and if I'm distracted, I won't notice I'm hungry. He's internally oriented, I'm externally. They did a whole bunch of studies. I was part of those studies where they looked at eating habits during Yom Kippur, and they found that the obese Orthodox Jews had a harder time fasting, than the normal size, and etc. And they did it with Air France pilots where there was a change in time and whatnot. Time, anything external, time of day, smell. So if you're a food addict, you don't want to pull up a chaise lounge at the mall in front of Mrs. Fields cookies, right? Because not only will you eat the cookies, but they'll find the remains of Mrs. Field, over the counter. However, if you're a Harry, you could sniff it, take a bite of a cookie and move on. That's why you're addicted to buying.
Thank you. That helps clear that up so much. We get so many questions about it. And so we try to ask all of our guests that it seems appropriate to ask about volume addiction. And I think yours has been the best explanation yet.
So here's the thing. So what, now what? Well, what does that mean? It means when my wife brings in food, all right, I'd rather see it in aluminum foil than saran wrap or in opaque containers. Why? Because you only find penicillin in your refrigerator when it's wrapped in tinfoil. You don't find palatable food left in the refrigerator that you can see. And when you look at the food industry, the picture or the packaging is there to stimulate the visual external cue. So if you walk into a supermarket, this is just the so what, now what, without a list, you'll walk out with $3,000 worth of junk food. Harry will walk out with a container of milk.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for explaining that so well. So hearing your personal and professional story, how they wove together, seeing how that came to be then, like with your interest in eating disorder work and food addiction work, I'm going to change gears just a little bit. We all sit on the Food Addiction Institute board together. And as we know, we've been working to give proposals to the World Health Organization and the American Psychological Association for consideration for this term of food addiction. And I'm just wondering, Marty, do you think food addiction is a term that furthers our cause, or do you think there's something more accurate, something more, acceptable to the professional world so that we can get people the help they need?
Yeah. So let me preface my response by saying that in my world, I have to speak 3 languages. The first language is the professional speak, the psychiatry, psychology, the professional nomenclature. The second language is insurance speak, suicidal ideation. Yes, someone, is gonna jump off the roof if they don't have a hamburger, that kind of thing. And the third language is recovery speak. If you'll notice, my dog has what we call the zoomies. She's a puppy, and she's a sheepadoodle. And my wife just returned from dog training. We have a fleet of professionals that are trying to deal with her behavioral problems. Anyway, so if you see her running up and down the stairs, you know what that is. We're not feeding her diet pills. Okay, so where was I? So the language is kind of fun. Here's something you should know. Having a treatment center, we do a lot of organic, get a lot of organic responses from Google or search engines. If I use the term addiction, they will cut out. They will cut out anything reference to me. If you Googled my name or Milestones, because there's lots of different reasons, but politically and otherwise, there are too many addiction treatment centers, and people get confused between treating drug addiction and the term anything like video addiction or sex addiction or food addiction. So there's that aspect of it. There's one other aspect of it. The American Psychiatric Association no longer recognizes the term addiction. In their criteria for what we would call addiction, like alcoholism, drug addiction, and whatnot, they use the term substance use disorder. And just to show how hypocritical they are, they throw in a process addiction that has nothing to do with a substance, is gambling. Why gambling as opposed to, all right, but they did. Okay, who knew? Anyway, so, and then it's mild, moderate, and severe. Right, it's sort of like the pickle. It's half sour, totally dill, sweet jerkin, who the hell knows? So that's what they have. Okay, so if you use the phrase food addiction, there are two problems. There's the public problem and professional problem. It'll never be accepted, in my estimation, in my lifetime, which might be short now, or your lifetime, as a legitimate term. Now, drug addiction isn't recognized professionally either. Are all drugs addictive? No. Are all foods addictive? No. But food addiction isn't accepted in our culture the way drug addiction is as a term. What can you use in its place? Your guess is as good as mine, because it would take one hell of a public relations campaign to educate the public at large. Keep in mind, when we talk about the public at large, excuse the pun, but public at large, the majority of Americans, this is the truth, think that chocolate milk comes from brown cows. So you tell me, so if you're grounded in reality, you might need to be talking to our audience about food as a substance and substance dependency, just like gambling, but it's not a process addiction. It's a chemical, and then, a lot of what I do when I give talks or lectures or whatnot is food as a substance use disorder. So, is it food dependency? Is it processed food dependency? And then you get into the realm of, well, it's like what drugs are addicting, so there's not an easy solution. It's like when you and I are talking, or we're talking, we both are on the same page about, for the most part, what the term food addiction is. But if I were talking to an audience of physicians or dietitians who don't work in this field, they would say, well, how could food be addicting? You need it to live. And my response would be, well, so's air and water, but you don't find treatment centers for, air addicts and water addicts. And food can be, if it's abused, can be deleterious to your health. So it's very difficult because of the language limitations. Don't have an answer.
Yeah, well, I'm just curious, does it make it even more challenging? All of these research papers and peer-reviewed articles use the term food addiction. When I was part of that team who helped create that proposal, we have 37 pages of sources, and food addiction is the term that they use.
Yeah, and I understand that. But it's like anything else. There's a quote I like when I do presentations, and I'll probably butcher it. But any concept that's new is ridiculed, and is spoken against, and then it's accepted partially, and then in the end it's given as fact. So does the Earth circle the sun, or does the sun circle the Earth, kind of a thing? I mean, people are burned at the stake for this stuff. So anyway, I understand what you're saying. It's a concept the handicap is the language. Those papers that you're talking about are not peer reviewed in the sense that they're generally accepted. You would never get one of those articles in the International Journal of Eating Disorders. And I would not get invited to speak to ASAM, which is the American Society of Addiction Medicine. They turned down, a whole bunch of workshops that I offered to do on food as a substance use disorder. And these are recovering physicians. So you tell me about, so if you want to do this professionally, research-wise, you want to talk about the specificity of certain components of food, like certain processed foods or certain ingredients, and use it as a substance use disorder backdoor rather than the term food addiction, because it's contemporary to investigation. I don't make the rules. I mean, I'm just telling you I'm just telling you what my experience is. They'll throw tomatoes at me if I say food addiction, but if I say sugar has addictive properties, not everybody that eats sugar becomes an addict. Alcohol has addictive properties. Not everybody that drinks becomes an alcoholic. Fentanyl has addictive properties, and not everybody that is given fentanyl becomes an addict. So you have to temper it with, looking at it from 30,000 feet, not right up in front of you.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. We really wanted to be sure to cover that with you because we just respect your years of experience, the work that you've done over the years, and your understanding of how research works and how peer review actually works, that kind of thing. So thank you so much for giving us that information. We are wondering, because of having the clinic and your years of experience, saying, now you're 102, so lots of years. Can you talk to us a little bit about—
Hurry up, I don't have long left.
Yeah, right. Oh, goodness. Can you talk to us a little bit about, when you're working with clients, do you notice or do you recognize, do you see a little something special, a characteristic, certain behaviors that really kind of indicate to you, yep, this person is going to be successful or is on a positive trajectory in their recovery?
That's a tough one. I think across the board with addiction, drug addiction, alcohol dependency, food addiction, bulimia, anorexia, I have seen people that I thought I would bet the ranch would not recover, who recovered. And I've seen people who I thought shouldn't have that much of a problem, just spiral downhill. I've seen people that have had horrific trauma in their life recover and have a quality of life and quality of recovery that, I would wish for myself. And I've seen people with histories where they didn't have trauma and they came from great families and really didn't, have much that they could complain about, not do well at all. So I have no way of predicting. And I think that my personal and professional experiences with 12-step programs across the board would probably lend testimony to that it's really a matter of whether you do the work and follow some kind of a path that is a better predictor. So if you were asking me what's the most effective predictor of success, it would be persistence, consistency, and discipline in practicing on a daily basis recovery. And my projection, meaning coming from my own experience, and I don't say this, from anything other than, teaching purposes, is I ascribe to a checklist, and I call it SMURF. And I find that if I'm doing certain things on a daily basis, so far for decades, it works for me. And the SMURF is an acronym. Actually, it's my butchering of HALT, hungry, angry, lonely, tired. So I've made it for eating disorders and myself and being in recovery as SMERF, spirituality, meditation. Of course, for some, it could be medication, meditation, exercise, rest, and food plan. And the spirituality is pretty much self-explanatory. It's your own flavor. It can include, but doesn't necessarily include any religious dogma or doctrine. It's just cultivating a belief in some kind of energy, force, or entity that is more important and more powerful than yourself. The exercise is not about compulsive exercising. It's in the spirit of recovery and taking care of your body. It's a balance between normalizing the mental energy with the physical energy. Because a lot of times people feel physically exhausted, but they haven't done anything. They're just mentally exhausted. So it's counterintuitive, but if you exercise your body, it balances out, and it's a good form of stress reduction. So I won't go into it too far. The meditation is not about, seeing God when your eyes are closed and seeing a burning bush. If that ever happened to me, I'd be in a rubber room. It's really about taking the time and acquiring an ability to sit still and observing how neurotic your mind is, or what thoughts come in and out, and not about controlling your thinking, but not having your thinking control you. So you can focus on breathing, you can focus on, and you could do it standing on your head. I mean, there are no instructions other than just do it, and you'll learn your way. The rest is balancing work and play. Most of us are either, in intensive care on life support, flipping a TV changer, or we're running around like a hamster on a wheel. And it's balancing, the work and play. And I also include self-care. So rest is, and sometimes rest is exercise, because if you're stressed out mentally, what rest is physically exerting yourself. Meditation can bleed into walking. So they all interrelate. And food is whatever are the boundaries around your food plan. Maybe your non-negotiables are sugar. Maybe your boundaries are sugar and white flour. Maybe your boundaries are sugar, flour of any kind, and grains. Maybe, but it's not intended to be a diet. A diet's like a straitjacket. If you spend too much time in it, you'll break out of it, and you'll never wear it again. We're not the same one. Your food plan should fit like comfortable clothing. It should be a rhythm. So you go through the stage of you're doing it because it's discipline, but then you get to a point you're doing it because it feels better to be doing it and uncomfortable not to be doing it. So with this whole SMURF routine that I'm speaking about, my experience has been, if one of those is missing for more than 2 days, I am very aware of feeling uncomfortable. Could be not going to a meeting for a couple of days, could be not doing something I do in the morning. If I go 2 days without meditating, if I don't get enough rest, or if I do a little bit too much volume on the food plan or whatever, I feel it. So one thing about recovery, if you have long-term recovery, you're acutely aware of any change.
And I mean, most of these tools, recovery tools, are free. So you can just use them every day, whenever you want. So that's the other part that's great about it. I'm wondering, Marty, you have been doing this for a while, working with food addiction treatment.
Right. My trauma was when Lincoln got shot. It was just terrible. It was a great play until that happened.
I so appreciate you. So what I'm trying to say is, when you began, probably you came into this with some beliefs, or maybe something you were taught, or something that, this is what we need to do to help people with food addiction. Is there anything that you have found working with individuals you had to become more flexible with and maybe have changed your practice than what you originally believed?
Yeah, I think like all of us, you learn the ideal. Like, a medical student gets out and does a residency, and they have very fixed ideas, and the learning curve is realizing one size doesn't fit all. And so when you look at medicine, it's an art form. It's not all science. When you look at what we're doing, it's an art form. It's not all science. So personally and professionally, the flexibility is recognizing, even though it's cliche, one size doesn't fit all. The other thing is that there aren't perfect analogies between abstinence from alcohol and drugs and food. And so dialectical behavior therapy has two premises amongst many that I feel are very important that I've had to learn. One is, I think Brene Brown coined the spirituality of imperfection, that, there is no perfection with food. There is, the reason there are in 12-step programs 11, 12, and 13 is because you need an eraser at the other end of the pencil. And so with food addiction and eating disorders, you can't be perfect, because if you're perfect, you're on a diet and you're in a straitjacket. So you have to have some permeable or semi-permeable boundaries, and some, that are fairly non-negotiable. With alcohol and drugs, it's fairly black and white. So you have to recognize some back doors, but at the same time, you can't lock all the doors. It won't work, in my experience. So what I've had to learn is that you're telling people, basically, it's sort of like when you go bowling. When you go bowling, every time you get up to roll the ball, your intention is to knock down all the pins. But it's totally unrealistic to bowl 300 every time you bowl. Now, the problem with neurotic people like us, or me, is you bowl and you don't knock down all the pins. You tear out the bowling score thing and you start over. Or if you were 5 and doing a coloring book and you just colored a smidge outside the line, you tore it up, threw a tantrum, and went on to the next page. That's not how life works. So in dialectical behavior therapy, there's no such thing as failing. There is such a thing as learning. And the other piece is that, you have to give yourself, you don't intend to deviate from your food plan, but life happens. So the other analogy is a pitcher gets up to pitch a perfect game every time he's playing baseball, but doesn't expect to do that. But the intention and the attempt is the best effort to do that a day at a time. And I think that's the difference between absolutes with black and white addictions and addictions like food or sex or shopping, or gambling. What's the difference between investing in stocks and day trading? What's the difference between an abstinent food plan, and an eating disorder, and being so rigid that you become orthorexic, that, that every food is unhealthy, every food is processed or tainted. So, the world isn't neatly packaged in black and white. That's what I had to learn.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because Clarissa and I have been learning that a lot along the way too. And I think we're both prior lives, other substance use disorder counselors, right? So we come from that world and bringing that to the food addiction world. And so we've been met with a lot of pushback, not only from the eating disorder world, because, all foods should fit and all things in moderation, but also from the food addiction world, where we really come from a harm reduction place and this very individualized approach, and not firing people for coming to us and doing the very thing they're coming to get help for.
Welcome to my world.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're really wondering, what do you think it will take to bridge those two camps, if you will,
Yeah.
the eating disorder world and the food addiction world?
The problem is a big one because you're dealing with individuals who have sets of experiences, but also fears. So if you look in the substance abuse world, you have subcategories. For instance, in the Jewish religion, there's Orthodox, conservative, and Reformed, right? Maybe in the Catholic Church, it might be the same, or anything, any, profession. In this world that you're talking about, you have some leaders that are very orthodox and feel if they give any wiggle room to their philosophy, that'll threaten their own recovery. So when you look in AA, for instance, and you see the old timers, what, you're taking a antidepressant, or the doctor prescribed, a narcotic, or that kind of thing. You get very dogmatic takes on things. Or the latest is medication assisted, treatment. So the contempt, pride, and investigation, the dogma, the rigidity is something that, you're not going to overcome just by saying it, because people have a personal investment in it. Now, the problem with that, I think, is the difference between a professional and someone who's invested in doing this work. They're coming from their personal experience being their teacher. And so everything's a projection of their own issue. When you're a professional, you're able to objectively evaluate that not everybody's the same as you. And so that's what you're up against. The hardest thing is to be an outlier, because there's so much pressure to conform. And I'll tell you how I've learned this. I met somebody that taught me something that I never forgot. They said, in recovery, this is with your substance abuse, issue. The people that have long-term recovery, it's not just that they work the steps and, and all of that. That is part of it. But they're what I call zebras. In the animal kingdom, zebras that have the longest lifespan are the ones that stay in the middle of the herd. The ones that drift from the herd and are around the periphery, they get picked off by the lions. So, we have to, no matter whatever your personal thing is, you need to stay in the middle of the pack. The problem is that there's more than just zebras in the world. And so you can't exclude other people, other species, but you want to stay around your tribe. So, but not every zebra is the same. So, there's male zebras, there's female zebras, there are zebras that don't know whether they want to be male or female. There, we have to be socially correct. There are zebras that dress up, for Halloween, except it's not Halloween. Zebras are zebras. So, other than dating in your own species, there are people that you come across. The problem is that at the same time that you want to be in your tribe, human nature, and this goes back to evolution, if you don't conform, the tribe will kick you out, and then you won't survive. You'll get picked off by the lions. So your dilemma is, how do you stay in the middle and diplomatically not get kicked out for heresy?
It's so true. And not only do you not kicked out, but how do you also not become so tunnel vision because you're in the center of the pack and you don't want to get right, that you're not open to other ideas, like you said, these other, there are other influences.
Truthfully, Smurf. And knowing what your truth is during meditation and whatnot. And if the two of you are friends, my hunch is that you're sub-tribe. And so it's your job is not to convince the herd to think like you. Your job is to be true to what your truth is. So when you look at people that have been successful in creating change over time, it's people that didn't try to convince the world it's their way or whatever. They went quietly along their business, and people got attracted to what the truth is. And that's happened since time immemorial. From Einstein to quantum physics to Bill Wilson, to all of it. If you want to be in the herd and just be a carbon copy of the herd, that's fine. But then there's no progress.
Attraction rather than promotion. Thank you, Marty.
Yeah, I mean, well, yeah. Don't you get attracted to certain sponsors? Don't you get attracted to certain groups? Don't you get attracted to certain components? I don't find that everybody that's in AA is my cup of tea, but I don't go around, thumping on a big book and saying, this is the way or whatever. I mean, I don't want to be kicked out.
Well, I think it's so important what you said, that we really need to find what's true for you and to just find your sub tribe. If that is the case, I'm so grateful that I met Molly and we support each other.
I get it. And believe me, there are people that I interface with, Phil and Esther and whatnot, who are, I guess you could describe as hardliners. But because I'm honest and I don't try to persuade them, they respect my views as being different. And the hardest sell I've ever had is saying that not all, but a lot of eating disorders are really it's really food addiction, that we're splitting hairs over semantics, and you're trying to carve out, uniqueness, and I'm trying to carve out where's the common ground, and where do you see the individual as opposed to a label.
And that is the whole idea behind why we created this summit, to showcase everyone who's doing the work in the field and to be able to allow people to be attracted to what speaks to their truth.
Right. Just understand that there's a price to be paid for this. It happened in OA. OA in 1960 was a very bigger organization than it is today, but then it factionized. HOL, HOW, Food Addicts Anonymous, Food Addicts, and then there were splinter groups and on and on and on, and it diluted the effect of the overall movement. So what ended up happening is there was an intolerance for dissension. The difference between a cult and a self-help group is the ability to tolerate dissension. If you dissent and you're not, exorcised or burned at the stake, then it's probably a healthy group. If you're expelled, you're talking about a cult. The reason AA's been successful is its group conscience, is blah, blah, blah. It's in its infinite wisdom. It doesn't encourage, but it doesn't throw people out because they dissent. So, that's what you're up against.
Oh my goodness. For reasons I won't go into today, I missed my therapy appointment yesterday, but I feel like this has been therapy for my soul, Marty. Everything you have just talked about today was literally what Clarissa and I were talking about moments before you got on with us. And
I'm sure you're a zebra.
Yes. There you go. Yeah. I appreciate that. And so one final question for you, and then we'll let you get back to, training your dog, who seems to have stopped the Zoomies, which is
understand the dog is training us.
There you go.
It's
yes,
an
exactly.
illusion.
It is an illusion. So our final question for you, what are your hopes for food addiction treatment and recovery in the future?
Yeah, that's a tough question. My hope is that there'll be more of an inclusive acceptance of people, that people will recognize that weight or appearance, it's a relevant piece, but it's more the symptom. And so that people don't talk in terms of obesity or weight, but they talk in terms of their relationship with food and body shame and that sort of thing. And look at food as either adding to the quality of their life or taking away from the quality of their life. And then recognizing that sometimes our relationships with certain substances or behaviors are more not a moral failure, but more of a disease or illness entity, and that the solution to that, involves addressing across the board the physical, acknowledgement of what's going on, the emotional acknowledgement of what's going on, and the existential or spiritual acknowledgement of what void needs to be filled. And those three pieces, I think, would serve any human being well, because I think the majority of people walking on this planet have some form of dependency or addiction of one or another. And that's their challenge in life, to, learn so they don't come back and have to learn it again.
Well, thank you so much for being here, Marty. It has
Sure.
been like a sugar-free treat, just getting to sit down and hear all your wisdom. So I just want to honor you for the work you're doing, and thank
Sure,
you
thank you.
so much for being
Thank
here
you.
today.
So our next podcast I'd like to do on parallel universes and quantum physics.
Bring it on.
I might be sick for that.
We can schedule it 1 year from now, so we have lots of time to study.
study.
Right. Just tell me which universe we'll be doing it in. Okay.
Sounds good. Thank you so much.
Not a problem. All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for joining us today on the Food Junkies Food Addiction Summit.
If you would like to hear more, tune in every Friday to the Food Junkies podcast, available on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, Audible, and anywhere else you listen to your favorite podcast. Subscribe so you'll never miss a show.
Don't forget to pick up a copy of Dr. Tarman's book, Food Junkies, which is available on Amazon.
If you have any additional questions, both Molly and Clarissa are food addiction professionals and work one-on-one with clients. Their websites and email addresses are available at foodjunkiespodcast.com.
As Vera always says, the power is ours.